As the months passed, Anne's hair grew back to its former length, only glossier and thicker. Her happiness grew too. She and Diana spent many happy hours together, racing along the sandy beaches, reading aloud to each other or simply talking quietly, as good friends do. Her confidence in school had also increased. By the time spring came, she was doing almost as well as Gilbert Blythe. Mr. Phillips discovered this during their monthly spelling bee. "Miss Andrews," he said, smiling slavishly at Prissy, "could you give us the spelling of the word chrysanthemum?" Prissy rose nervously. Spelling was not her strong point. C-H-R-I-S. Oh gosh. A-N-S. A-M-U-M, she said, all in a tizzy. "Gilbert," faltered poor Mr. Phillips, trying to conceal his disappointment. Gilbert stood up. "C-H-R-Y-S-A-N-T-H-A-M-U-M, he said confidently. Mr. Phillips' brow darkened. "Anne?" he inquired. Anne didn't hesitate. "C-H-R-Y-S-A-N-T-H-E-M-U-M. "Correct," said Mr. Phillips in amazement. With a smug toss of her head, Anne sat down. Josie Pye looked crestfallen. "Hey, Anne," she jeered later, as Anne and Diana prepared to set off for home. "How do you spell freckles?" "Hey, Josie," retorted Diana, quick as a flash. "How do you spell ugly?" Gilbert ran after the two girls. "Congratulations on the spelling test, Anne," he said warmly. Anne nodded at him with icy disdain. "Thank you, Mr. Blythe, but allow me to inform you that next time I shall be first in every subject." Grasping firm hold of Diana's arm, she marched off home. She had evidently made up her mind to hate Gilbert Blythe to the end of her life. "Don't we have enough flowers right outside our door, Anne?" asked Marilla, as she came downstairs one bright summer afternoon, dressed in her Sunday finery. Anne paused in her arrangement of a bouquet of wild blossoms. "I want the house to look truly flowery to impress Diana," she explained. For Diana was expected to tea that very afternoon, and Anne, wearing her second-best dress in honor of the occasion, was to be sole hostess. "May I use the rosebud spray tea set, Marilla?" she asked. "No, indeed. The everyday set will do well enough for your company," answered Marilla, drawing on her gloves. "But you may have the fruitcake and the cherry preserves. And there's a bottle of raspberry cordial on the shelf in the kitchen." "Oh, Marilla!" Anne clasped her hands. "How perfectly lovely! It will all seem so nice and grown-uppish." Marilla adjusted her hat in the hall mirror. "Now don't forget to tell Matthew that Mrs. Allan will drive me back from the Ladies' Aid. And remember to see that Matthew and Jerry Butte's supper is laid out for them." A prim knock sounded on the front door. It was Diana, dressed in her second-best dress, and looking exactly as it is proper to look when asked out to tea. "Have a lovely afternoon, ladies," smiled Marilla, taking her leave. The girls shook hands gravely, as if they had never met before. "Please come in and make yourself comfortable," said Anne, in her best hostess manner. "Why, thank you. How kind of you," answered Diana formally. Once in the sitting room, both would-be ladies sat stiffly together, their hands folded just so in their laps, their toes in position. But polite inquiries as to Mrs. Barry's health and Matthew's potato crop failed to hold their attention for very long, and pretty soon they had abandoned their attempt at dignity and were talking and laughing as usual. "It isn't good manners to tell your guests what you're serving, so I won't tell you what Marilla said we could have to drink. But it begins with an R and a C, and it's a bright red color," announced Anne, jumping up and running to look for the promised liquid. It wasn't on the second shelf of the cupboard, where she expected it to be. Search revealed it away back on the top shelf. Anne placed the unlabeled bottle with a tumbler on a tray and set it on a table near Diana. "Oh, raspberry cordial, my favorite!" exclaimed Diana delightedly. "I'm really glad you like it," said Anne politely. "I've never tasted it before in my life. I shall have to wait, though, because first I want to run out and stir the fire up. You take as much as you want, Diana." When Anne came back from the kitchen with the tea tray, Diana was drinking her second glass of cordial. She made no objection when Anne offered her a third. The tumblerfuls were generous ones, and the red liquid delicious. "The nicest I ever drank," announced Diana. Her words sounded a trifle slurred. "It's ever so much nicer than Mrs. Lynde's, although she brags of hers so much. It doesn't taste a bit like hers." "That's probably because Marilla is a much better cook," said Anne loyally, as she poured the tea. "Why, Diana, whatever is the matter?" For Diana had stood up, swaying slightly. Then she sat down again very suddenly, holding onto her stomach. "I'm awful sick," she announced thickly. I gotta go home." But instead of standing up again, she slumped over in a most unladylike manner. "Oh, you mustn't dream of going home without your tea," cried Anne in distress. "And here, you must try some fruitcake and some of the cherry preserves." She thrust a plateful of the sweet-smelling delicacies under Diana's nose. Diana's nostrils widened, and she buried her face in her lace-trimmed handkerchief. "Perhaps you need a little more cordial," suggested Anne helpfully. She poured another tumblerful and watched as Diana obediently drank it down. But instead of helping, the cordial seemed to make Diana feel worse. Before Anne's horrified eyes, she keeled over sideways and landed flat on her face on the sofa. "I must go home," she mumbled, her eyes closing. "No, no, Diana. You stretch out on the sofa for a little while and you'll feel better. Where does it hurt?" Diana's answer was lost in the sofa cushions. Only the word home was audible. "I never heard of company going home without tea," mourned Anne. "Oh, Diana, please do stay." But Diana heaved herself off the sofa, pushed past Anne, and groped her way toward the hall door. She seemed to walk very strangely. With tears of disappointment in her eyes, Anne fetched Diana's hat and parasol and hurried after her. Mrs. Barry, Diana's mother, was enjoying her afternoon with Mrs. Lynde. Seated on the Barry porch, they had spent their time working on a quilt and dissecting the reputations of the people of Avonlea. All of a sudden, she heard Diana's returning footsteps. Glancing up, she saw her daughter stagger up the porch steps and stand in front of her, swaying back and forth like a drunk! "Why, she's drunk as a coot!" screamed Rachel Lynde, who had dropped her quilting and darted over to steady the swaying girl. In doing so, she had received a full blast of Diana's alcohol-laden breath. "My Diana? No, it isn't possible," whispered Mrs. Barry, who felt as if she had just awakened into a nightmare. But there was Diana, clapping her hand over her mouth and running back down the steps to be violently ill all over Mrs. Barry's prized azaleas. And there was that Anne Shirley, standing on the porch now, her big eyes fixed anxiously on Diana. "Anne Shirley," hissed Mrs. Barry, "what did you give my Diana to drink?" "Only raspberry cordial, Mrs. Barry," faltered Anne. "Raspberry cordial, my foot!" snorted Rachel Lynde. "Why, that girl smells like Jake Griffith's distillery." With the startling clarity of a nightmare, it occurred to Mrs. Barry that not only was Mrs. Rachel the town gossip, she was also chairwoman of the Temperance Society. The good name of Barry was destroyed forever, and Mrs. Barry knew exactly who was to blame. "You are a wicked, wicked girl, Anne Shirley," she flashed. "I should never have let Diana associate with an orphan like you. She will never do so again. Now leave this property at once." Words of protest sprang to Anne's lips, but the hostility and outrage she read on both adult faces silenced her. Very carefully, she placed Diana's hat and parasol on the front steps. Then she turned and fled. When Marilla came home that evening, she found Anne lying on the sofa, weeping as though her heart would break. "Whatever has gone wrong now, Anne?" she queried in doubt and dismay. "I do hope you haven't been saucy to Mrs. Rachel again." No answer from Anne, save more tears and stormier sobs. "Anne Shirley, when I ask you a question, I want to be answered. Sit right up this very minute and tell me what you are crying about." Anne sat up, tragedy personified. "Mrs. Barry says that I set Diana drunk," she wailed. "And she says I must be a thoroughly bad, wicked girl, and she's never going to let Diana play with me again. Oh, Marilla, I'm just overcome with woe." Marilla stared in blank amazement. "Drunk," she said, when she had found her voice. "What on earth did you give her to drink?" "Nothing but raspberry cordial," sobbed Anne. "I never thought it would make her drunk, Marilla, even if she did drink 3 big tumblerfuls." Marilla marched into the kitchen and returned with the offending bottle. Her face was twitching in spite of herself. "You certainly have a genius for trouble, child," she announced. "This is currant wine, not raspberry cordial. I probably put the cordial in the cellar myself instead of on the shelf in the cupboard. Now stop crying, Anne. It's not your fault. I'll go over and explain the mistake to Mrs. Barry." But Mrs. Barry was not interested in Marilla's explanations. "That Anne Shirley is a sly, deceitful child, and she's pulled the wool well over your eyes, Marilla," she snapped. Rachel Lynde was determined to put her oar in, too. "I've warned you about that currant wine, Marilla," she announced self-righteously. "It's the demon liquor that's at fault here, and if you didn't insist on making that wine—" This was more than Marilla could take. "My currant wine is famous all over this island, as you well know, Rachel Lynde," she broke in. "Why, even the Reverend Allen himself takes a drop when he comes calling. And as to Christian virtue, making a little wine for refreshment is far less sinful than meddling in other people's affairs." There was a moment's stunned silence. Before either woman could gather her wits for a suitably stinging reply, Marilla turned on her heel and swept from the Barry home in a storm of indignation. The next afternoon, Anne, busy with her household chores, happened to glance out the kitchen window. She was astonished to see Diana waving frantically from the nearby field. In a trice, Anne was out of the house and running to meet her friend, hope springing up in her heart. The hope faded when she saw Diana's dejected expression. "Your mother hasn't forgiven me, then?" she asked. Diana shook her head. "No, Anne. I told her it wasn't your fault, and I cried and cried. But it's no use. We can't ever be friends again." "Oh, Diana," said Anne tearfully. "We must stay secret friends at least. Will you swear to be my secret bosom friend?" Diana looked even more troubled. "But isn't it wicked to swear?" she asked doubtfully. "We're in enough trouble already." "Not if you're swearing a vow," Anne assured her. Taking Diana's hand in her own, she intoned, "I solemnly swear to remain faithful to my bosom friend Diana Barry as long as the sun and the moon shall endure. Now you say it, Diana." When Diana had repeated the vow to Anne's satisfaction, Anne pulled out her little patchwork scissors from her apron pocket. "Now wilt thou give me a lock of thy jet-black tresses?" she inquired soulfully. "But I don't have any black dresses," objected Diana, puzzled. "Your hair, silly," said Anne, temporarily dropping her tragic actress voice. "Oh, my hair. Yes, of course," agreed Diana. After the hair-cutting ceremony was over, the friends hugged each other sadly. Then Anne stood and watched Diana run out of sight. Their romantic parting had been almost as satisfying as if Mrs. Barry had wept and forgiven her. "Fare thee well, my beloved friend," she whispered. "Henceforth we must be as strangers living side by side, but my heart will be ever faithful to thee." Anne had expected to die from grief at being parted from her bosom friend. Much to her own surprise, she survived. But as week followed lonely week and Mrs. Barry still did not relent, Anne found she missed Diana more and more, partly to distract herself from her sense of loss, and partly out of a natural desire to learn. She flung herself heart and soul into her studies. With the new school year came a new teacher, and in Miss Stacy, Anne found a bright and helpful guide. "I want to look back on this class as having been the most imaginative, the most committed students on Prince Edward Island," Miss Stacy had said that first morning as she introduced herself, and Anne's soul had expanded like a flower. "She has such a gentle voice, and when she says my name, I feel instinctively that she's spelling it with an E," Anne had confided to Matthew. Miss Stacy was aware that there was some trouble between Diana and Anne, but it wasn't until she had a visit from Mrs. Barry, warning her to forbid all association between the two girls, that she began to understand where the trouble lay. She mentioned Mrs. Barry's visit to Anne one day after school. "I don't think, Anne," she said with a smile, "that Mrs. Barry entirely approves of you." Anne sighed. "I'm afraid you're right, Miss Stacy," she agreed. "But then I don't think God himself would meet entirely with Mrs. Barry's approval." She was silent for a moment. "I think I can cope with the social persecution of being an orphan," she added slowly. "I've grown used to that. But it's a terrible injustice to be falsely accused." "What we must bear in mind, Anne," said Miss Stacy, "is that all these trials and troubles that pop up in our lives often serve a useful purpose. They build character. And remember, tomorrow is always fresh, with no mistakes in it. It's just that I miss Diana terribly, Miss Stacy." Miss Stacy patted Anne's hand. "Don't lose heart, child. Diana will always be your friend, no matter what anyone accuses you of. In the end, the truth will set you free." "The truth will set you free," echoed Anne, touched by the beauty of the words as much as by Mrs. Stacy's compassion. She felt warmed by the knowledge that she had found in her new teacher another kindred spirit. A few weeks after her talk with Miss Stacy, Anne was in the kitchen helping Marilla prepare dinner. "Go fetch that leftover sauce from the pantry, child," instructed Marilla. "I'll warm it up for tonight's pudding." Anne stepped into the pantry. As she picked up the bowl, she almost screamed in horror, for there, floating in the yellowy liquid, lay a drowned mouse. With a pang of guilt, Anne remembered that Marilla had asked her to cover the bowl the night before, when she was putting it away. Quickly she reached for a ladle, scooped out the pathetic corpse and wrapped it in newspaper, keeping her eyes averted all the time. Then she sneaked out of the house and buried the body in the yard. Anne fully intended to confess her sin to Marilla, but just how to phrase it posed a problem. She reflected on this as she washed her hands at the sink. "We've already tried sauce on our pudding, Marilla," she ventured brightly. "Perhaps it's only fair the pigs should be allowed some on their feed tonight." Marilla stared at her. "Waste our precious pudding sauce on the pigs? Anne Shirley, have you taken leave of your senses?" "I forgot to put the cheesecloth over it last night, Marilla. I was imagining I was a nun on my way to the altar to take the veil and—" Marilla was no longer listening. Her attention had been distracted by a knock on the front door. "Goodness gracious, I wonder who that could be at this hour," she said, taking off her apron and hurrying to answer. The unexpected caller turned out to be Miss Stacy. in the excitement of seeing her beloved teacher step into the parlor at Green Gables. All thoughts of drowned mice and tainted sauce vanished from Anne's mind. "I was just over at the Berries, Miss Cuthbert," explained Miss Stacy, "and I thought I'd take this opportunity to stop by." Marilla's heart sank. "What's you been up to now, Miss Stacy? Don't tell me this misunderstanding with the Barry family has made her neglect her studies." Miss Stacy smiled. "Quite the contrary, Miss Cuthbert. Anne's work is excellent, which is why I'm here. I wondered whether you would permit her to join a special class. You see, I intend to give extra tutoring after school to those students who wish to take the entrance exams for Queen's." The wariness in Marilla's eyes gave way to surprise. "The college in Charlottetown? Our Anne?" "Your Anne is bright and energetic and very determined," replied Miss Stacy. "I think she could pass as a teacher or even go on to the university." Marilla's smile was dazzling. "Why, of course," she beamed. "Of course she can join the class if she wants to." Then Marilla, radiating pride, had insisted Miss Stacy join them for supper. Supper had passed in a flurry of chatter and gaiety. Even tongue-tied Matthew had joined in the conversation once or twice. It wasn't until Marilla was actually carrying in the dessert, the pudding in one hand and the pitcher of warmed-up sauce in the other, that Anne, fear striking at her heart, suddenly remembered the miserable mouse. Dumb with horror, she saw Marilla pour sauce over Miss Stacy's portion of pudding. Hypnotized, she watched as Miss Stacy raised the spoon to her lips. Then, just as Miss Stacy opened her mouth, Anne found her voice. "Don't eat it, Miss Stacy!" she screamed at the top of her lungs. Miss Stacy's spoon clattered to her plate. Marilla pushed back her chair. "Anne Shirley, what is wrong with you?" she demanded, turning red as fire. "A mouse drowned in the sauce, Marilla," moaned Anne. "I was working up courage to tell you when Miss Stacy came and told us all about studying for Queen's, and then Why, Miss Stacy," she paused, her attention completely distracted. "Whatever is the matter?" For Miss Stacy had buried her face in her table napkin. Her shoulders were shaking. Anne turned to Matthew for guidance. Tears were trickling down his cheeks. In utter bewilderment, she appealed to Marilla. But Marilla's eyes were closed. Her head was thrown back, and her whole body was convulsed with laughter. Anne stared at them all, baffled. Then she shrugged. "I suppose in the end it was a romantic way to perish," she concluded doubtfully. "For a mouse." As winter set in, the small group of would-be Queen scholars set to work with a will under Miss Stacy's expert guidance. Anne truly enjoyed studying. When the regular day students had gone home, she liked nothing better than to move with the 5 or 6 remaining pupils to the front of the class. She loved the quiet scratching of Miss Stacy's chalk on the board, the silent concentration of the others around her, and the warm glow of the schoolroom as the light darkened outside. The only flaw in her happiness was that Mrs. Barry had refused to let Diana study for the entrance to Queen's. "Mother says I should concentrate on learning to run a household, instead of always having my nose stuck in a book," Diana had confided in a brief conversation, snatched while the day students were preparing to go home. "Oh, Diana," grieved Anne, "I feel as though you've tasted the bitterness of death." As she watched Diana go slowly out with the others, to walk alone along the paths they had so often trod together, Anne felt a lump come into her throat. Hastily, she retired behind the pages of her Latin grammar. Not for worlds would Anne have had Gilbert Blythe or Josie Pye, or any of the other aspiring Queen scholars, see the tears that filled her eyes. That winter, a mass meeting was organized in Charlottetown in honor of the Prime Minister's visit to Prince Edward Island, in the firm belief that no gathering of any kind could succeed without her. Mrs. Rachel Lynde insisted on going. She took her husband, Thomas, with her. Thomas would be useful in looking after the horse. Marilla, who had a genuine interest in politics, went along too. She left Anne and Matthew to keep house alone until her return the following day. "What way do you vote, Matthew?" asked Anne that evening. A bright fire was glowing in the grate, and blue-white frost crystals were shining on the window panes. Matthew was nodding over a copy of the Farmer's Advocate, while Anne was supposed to be studying her geometry. "Conservative," said Matthew, blinking awake. "Then I'm conservative too," said Anne decidedly. "I'm glad, because some of the boys at school are grits. Ruby Gillis says that when a man is courting, he always has to agree with the girl's mother in religion and her father in politics. Ruby Gillis knows all about courting because she has 3 older sisters. Did you ever go courting, Matthew?" "Well now, no, I dunno's I ever did," said Matthew, who had certainly never thought of such a thing in his whole existence. "Never ever? Why not, Matthew?" "Well now, I couldn't do it without talking to a girl." "What a great loss." Anne shook her head sadly. "I'm sure there were many broken hearts on this island as a result." Matthew blushed and concentrated fiercely on his Farmer's Advocate. For a while Anne gazed into the fire, then returned her attention reluctantly to her geometry. A few moments later, the harmonious silence was interrupted by the sound of flying footsteps on the icy boardwalk outside. The next instant the kitchen door was flung open, and in rushed Diana Barry, white-faced and breathless, a shawl wrapped hastily around her head. "Oh, Anne, do come quick," she implored. "My little sister is awful sick. She's got croup, Mary Jo says. Father and Mother are away at the rally, and there's nobody to go for the doctor." Without a word, Matthew reached out for cap and coat, slipped past Diana, and away into the darkness of the yard. "He's gone to harness the mare to go to Carmody for the doctor," said Anne, who was pulling on her warm, hooded jacket. "We're such kindred spirits, I can read his thoughts." "I don't believe he'll find the doctor at Carmody," sobbed Diana. "He's probably at the rally, too. Oh, Anne, I'm so scared. Poor little Minnie May can't breathe." Anne was unlocking the medicine chest. "Don't forget that Mrs. Hammond had 3 sets of twins. When you look after all those babies, you naturally get a lot of experience. Now just calm down, Diana. I know the ipecac is here somewhere. It's an expectorant, you see," she added knowledgeably, producing the bottle from the back of the cabinet. "It helps you cough up whatever's blocking your breathing." She stuffed the bottle of medicine into her coat pocket, then grasped Diana's hand. Together they hastened out into the darkness. The night was clear and frosty, all ebony of shadow and silver of snowy slope. Big stars were shining over the silent fields. Here and there black-pointed firs stood up with snow powdering their branches and the wind whistling through them. Although truly worried about Diana's sister, Anne could not help responding to the night's mystery and loveliness, and to the sweetness of sharing it all with her closest friend, who had been so long a stranger. Minnie May was really very sick. Her hoarse breathing could be heard all over the house. Anne went to work with skill and promptness. "Mary Jo, you may put some wood on the fire," she instructed the bewildered mother's helper. "I don't want to hurt your feelings, but it seems to me you should have thought of it before if you'd had any imagination. You try to find some soft flannel cloths, Diana. I'm going to give Minnie May a good dose of ipecac." Minnie May did not take kindly to the ipecac, but Anne had not brought up 3 sets of twins for nothing. Down that ipecac went, not only once, but many times during the long, anxious night. It was 3 o'clock before Matthew arrived with the doctor. He had been obliged to go all the way to Spencervale for one. By this time, the pressing need for help had passed. Minnie May was much better and was sleeping soundly. I was awfully near giving up in despair, explained Anne to the doctor, as he listened to Minnie May's chest. She got worse and worse, until she was sicker than ever the Hammond twins were. I actually thought she was going to choke to death. I gave her every drop of ipecac in that bottle. When the last dose went down, I had almost given up hope. But in about 3 minutes she coughed up the phlegm and began to get better right away. You must just imagine my relief, doctor. Some things cannot be expressed in words. Yes, I know, nodded the doctor. He looked at Anne as if he were thinking some things about her that couldn't be expressed either. Later on, though, when Mrs. Barry returned, he managed to find just the right words. I tell you, that little red-headed girl saved your baby's life. It would have been too late by the time I got there, he said. Mrs. Barry had stroked Minnie May's head tenderly and swallowed hard. In the white frosted winter dawn, Anne drove home with Matthew. Isn't it a wonderful morning, Matthew? She sighed, as the sleigh sped across the snow-covered fields. Doesn't the whole world look like something God had just imagined for his own pleasure? I'm really sorry I was ever cross with Mrs. Hammond for having twins. If she hadn't, I mightn't have known what to do for Minnie May. But oh, Matthew, I'm so sleepy. I can't go to school. I just know I couldn't keep my eyes open, but I hate to stay home. Gil, some of the others, will get ahead of me and... Anne fell asleep in mid-sentence. Matthew gazed down fondly at the small white face with the dark shadows under the eyes. Very gently he put one arm around her to prevent her falling out of the sleigh. It was well on in the white and rosy winter afternoon when Anne awoke and came down to the kitchen. Marilla looked up from her knitting. Her eyes were merry. Mrs. Barry's been over here, begging to see you. But I wasn't about to wake you. You're invited over for dinner, Anne, she chuckled. I imagine humble pie is on the menu. Anne rushed to the door. Oh, Marilla, can I go right now, before I do my chores? I'm simply aching to see Diana. Run along, child, said Marilla indulgently. But Anne was already out the door and tearing through the orchard, her hair streaming behind her. Marilla was right. Humble pie was indeed on the menu at the Barry household. Mrs. Barry kissed Anne and cried and apologized for ever doubting her word. I felt fearfully embarrassed, Marilla, Anne recounted later when she got home that night. But I just assured her that I had never meant to intoxicate Diana, and that I was ready to cover the past with a mantle of oblivion. And Mrs. Barry put the very best china out, just as if I was real company. I can't tell you what a thrill it gave me. Nobody ever used their very best china on my account before. But the biggest thrill of all had come when Mrs. Barry had invited Anne to accompany them to the Christmas ball at Carmody. She said they'd be honored if I would stay overnight with Diana, too, Anne finished. It's going to be a very special occasion, and I'm to be their guest of honor. Marilla's response was unexpectedly harsh. You can calm down because you're not going, she declared flatly, her eyes fixed on her knitting. For a woman so firmly against currant wine, she's being strangely indulgent, I must say. I'm surprised she's allowing Diana to go. A ball is for adults, not children. But Marilla, pleaded Anne, it's Christmas, and I'm to be the guest of honor. I'm invited to spend the night, in the spare bedroom, too. Think of the honor of your Anne being put in the spare room bed. Well, it's just an honor you'll have to forego, said Marilla firmly. You heard what I said, Anne. Now off to bed. Anne looked at Matthew imploringly, but Matthew's attention seemed miles away. He was chewing thoughtfully on his pipe stem, staring into the fire. This is a wound I shall bear forever, sighed Anne tragically, as she trudged off to bed. When the door had closed behind her, Matthew removed his pipe from his mouth. Well now, Marilla, he said, I think you ought to let her go. "Who's bringing this child up, you or me?" retorted Marilla. "That Mrs. Barry just wants to ease her conscience, and I'm not going to allow it." Matthew clamped his lips around his pipe and drew on it in silence. "And no amount of huffing and puffing from you is going to change my mind," snapped Marilla. "You'd let her go to the moon if she had the notion." "Well, I don't approve of balls. She'd just have her head filled up with nonsense." Matthew cleared his throat. "Fact is, Marilla," he said slowly, "you never went to a ball. Fact is, this whole idea's got you scared to death." Marilla put down her knitting and stared at her brother in shock. "That little girl ought to have all the kindness we can give her," continued Matthew. "We got no call to raise her as cheerless as we was. Besides, it's Christmas. I think you ought to let her go." For once, no quick reply sprang to Marilla's lips. Anne was washing dishes in martyred silence the next morning when Marilla entered the kitchen. "Very well," she said curtly to Anne's reproachful back. "You may go." Anne whirled around, dripping dishcloth in hand. "Oh, Marilla, say those blessed words again," she exclaimed. "I guess once is enough to say them," replied Marilla. "This is all Matthew's doing, and I wash my hands of it. If you catch pneumonia sleeping in a strange bed or coming out of that overheated hall in the middle of the night, don't blame me, blame Matthew." "I dreamt last night that I arrived at the ball in puffed sleeves," confided Anne, "and everyone was overcome by my regal entrance." "Regal my eye," sniffed Marilla. "You're dripping greasy dishwater all over my nice clean floor, Anne Shirley. And if I have to listen to any more of this puffed sleeve nonsense, I'll just change my mind, that's what I'll do." Anne returned meekly to her dishes, determined never to mention the longed-for sleeves again. Matthew was covered in confusion. He had deliberately chosen Samuel Lawson's store, feeling sure that either Samuel or his son would wait on him. Alas, the door had closed behind him, and instead of being greeted by a solid, comfortable man, Matthew could see a lady clerk stalking him from behind the counter. A very dashing young person she was, too, with big, rolling brown eyes and a most generous and bewildering smile. She was dressed with exceeding smartness and wore several bangle bracelets that glittered and tinkled and completely wrecked Matthew's wits. "What can I do for you, Mr. Cuthbert?" inquired this person, whose name was Lucilla Harris. She tapped the counter briskly with both hands. The bracelets rattled and clattered. "Well now, have you got any garden rakes?" stammered Matthew. "We don't usually carry rakes in December," responded Miss Harris, "but I'll go check upstairs. We may have one or two in storage." During her absence, Matthew collected his senses for another try. "Anything else, Mr. Cuthbert?" inquired Lucilla, when she returned bearing the last rake in the store. "Well now, since you suggest it, Matthew dropped his voice. "I may as well take some hayseed." Miss Harris had heard Matthew Cuthbert called odd. She now decided he was entirely crazy. "We only keep hayseed in the spring," she explained loftily. "We've none on hand just now." Matthew rallied his powers for a final attempt. "Well now, if it isn't too much trouble, I'd like to look at some sugar. Yes, some sugar." "White or brown?" asked Miss Harris patiently. Beads of perspiration stood out on Matthew's forehead. "Which would you suggest?" he inquired desperately. "There's a barrel of brown over there," said Miss Harris, shaking her bangles at it. "It's the only kind we have in stock." I'll take 20 pounds of it." "Yes, 20 pounds, decided Matthew fervently. As Miss Harris was totting up his bill, Matthew cast a final frantic look around the store. Then he leaned over the counter toward Miss Harris's ear. "I need a dress," he gasped. Miss Harris gazed at him in shock. "With puffed sleeves," croaked Matthew. "For Anne," he added quickly, seeing her expression. Miss Harris passed a hand over her eyes. Her bangles tinkled delicately. "Land's sakes, Mr. Cuthbert," she smiled. "Why didn't you say so in the first place? Now you come over here with me to the window. I've got just the thing. Puffed sleeves, did you say?" Anne stared at the dress in disbelief. How pretty it was! A lovely cloudy blue with all the gloss of silk. A skirt with dainty frills and shearings. A waist elaborately pin-tucked in the most fashionable way, with a ruffle of filmy lace at the neck. But the sleeves were the crowning glory. They had long elbow cuffs, and above them 2 beautiful puffs, divided by bows of blue silk ribbon. Could it really be for her? Quickly, she slipped it on and ran downstairs. Marilla stood at the kitchen table contemplating a giant bag of brown sugar. "Marilla, just look at the puffs!" Anne twirled in delight around the kitchen. Marilla snorted. "They're ridiculous, as big as balloons. You'll have to turn sideways to get through the doors." All the same, she couldn't help noticing how graceful Anne looked in the longer skirt. "She's growing up real straight and slim," she thought with pride, as Anne hurried off to thank Matthew. Anne found Matthew in the barn. From a window high up in the eaves, a shaft of wintry sunlight pierced the quiet dimness, setting the dust motes dancing and falling on Matthew's stooped figure as he bent over a sack of grain. Anne felt as though her dress lit the whole barn with a blaze of blue. Matthew looked up as she came in and grinned with pleasure. "Well now, I guess I should have waited till Christmas, but I thought you might want to wear it to the ball." Why don't you like it?" he asked, suddenly concerned, for Anne's eyes had filled with tears. "Like it? Oh, Matthew!" Anne clasped her hands. "It's more exquisite than any dress I could ever imagine." In that instant, Matthew felt that all his suffering in the Lawson store had been worthwhile. He nodded his head toward Anne's elbows. "Puffed sleeves," he noted, in the tone of an expert. "The puffiest in the world," exulted Anne. "You are a man of impeccable taste, Matthew." Very shyly, Matthew bent down and kissed the top of Anne's head. "Mustn't get your dress dirty," he said gruffly. But Anne, forgetting all about her new dress in the rush of love she felt for him, threw her arms around Matthew and hugged him tightly. The night of the ball passed like a beautiful dream for Anne. Clutching their dance cards, their eyes ashine, and their hair gleaming, she and Diana had watched in dazed admiration as the dancers swirled around the floor. Anne was delightfully conscious that no one in the room had puffier sleeves than she did. Diana felt a twinge of jealousy at the sight of Alice Bell's new hairstyle. "I think she looks ridiculous," she declared to Anne. "She's only 17 and she's put her hair up already. I'm going to wait till I'm 18. But Anne's attention was elsewhere. She had caught sight of Gilbert Blythe dancing with Josie Pye. She pretended not to notice, but somehow she felt as if her puffed sleeves had lost some of their puff. "It's too bad you've been so awful to him," said Diana, whose sharp eyes had noticed the direction of Anne's glance. "He might have asked you to dance." Anne only tossed her head and assured Diana she certainly didn't care to dance with Gilbert Blythe. This turned out to be just as well, for Gilbert studiously ignored Anne all night. Perhaps he felt it was time to give her a taste of her own medicine. Anne and Diana danced with each other instead, and what with trying to keep time to the lilting music and not step on each other's toes, the evening passed in a whirl of laughter. Perhaps because he did his best to appear to have a good time, Gilbert found the ball rather a strain. As he stood at the edge of the room, trying to decide whom he ought to dance with next. He caught sight of Anne's dance card, lying abandoned on the refreshments table. Picking it up, he folded it in two, then placed it carefully in his breast pocket. It was very late when the girls returned to Diana's house. Mr. and Mrs. Barry went instantly to bed, but the small parlor, which opened into the spare room, was pleasantly warm and dimly lighted by the embers of a fire in the grate. Anne and Diana tiptoed in and changed into their nightclothes by its glow. "I bet Gilbert took your dance card, and that's why you couldn't find it," Diana giggled as she waltzed lightly around the shadowy room. "Such a romantic gesture would be beyond his imagination," sniffed Anne. But that hope had occurred to her, too. "Well, who then? Josie Pye?" persisted Diana giddily. Anne had no intention of discussing the matter further. "How about I race you to bed? I'll just bet I get to jump in first," she suggested brightly. "On your mark, get set, go!" Two white-clad figures flew down the long room, through the spare room door, and bounded on the bed at the same moment. And then something moved beneath them. There was a gasp and a cry, and a voice was saying in muffled tones, "Merciful goodness!" Anne and Diana were never able to tell how they got off that bed and out of the room. They only knew that after one frantic rush, they found themselves creeping upstairs. "Oh, who was it? What was it?" whispered Anne, her teeth chattering with cold and fright. "It was Aunt Josephine," said Diana, gasping with laughter. "We weren't expecting her till tomorrow. I know she's going to be absolutely furious about this, and oh dear." Diana's giggles stopped abruptly. "I suppose I shall have to wave goodbye to my music lessons now." "What music lessons?" shivered Anne. "I've always wanted music lessons, and Aunt Josephine promised I should have some. She's the only one in our family who's rich enough to pay for them, you see." "It was my fault, Diana. I won't have you lose your music lessons because of me." It seemed to Anne that Diana had been deprived of enough lessons already. "I'll just have to have a talk with your Aunt Josephine in the morning." "Anne, surely you'd never—" "Why, she'll eat you alive," protested Diana. "She's awfully prim and proper. Now hush," she whispered, putting her finger to her lips and opening the door to the room she shared with her sister. "You're just going to have to sleep with Minnie May tonight. And don't move a muscle, because she kicks like a mule." Anne felt like she was walking into a dragon's den when she approached Aunt Josephine's room the next morning. But she screwed up her courage and knocked. A sharp "Come in" followed. Miss Josephine Barry, thin, prim, and rigid, wheeled round from the desk where she had been writing. Her eyes snapped as she surveyed her visitor from top to toe. "What's this?" she growled. "Come to finish the job, have you?" Whatever little courage Anne had mustered drained away. "I'm sorry I startled you, ma'am," she whispered. "Who are you?" demanded the dragon. "Anne of Green Gables." Anne twisted her fingers together nervously. "And I've come to confess." "I am not interested," pronounced the dragon, "in the confessions of assassins who masquerade as little girls." "It was all my fault about jumping into bed on you, Miss Barry. I suggested it. Diana would never have thought of such a thing. Diana is far too ladylike. So I think you ought to forgive her and let her have her music lessons back. Diana's heart is set on music lessons, and I know too well what it is to set your heart on a thing and not get it. If you must be cross with someone, be cross with me. I've been so used in my early days to having people cross at me that I can endure it much better than Diana can." Much of the snap had gone out of the old lady's eyes by this time. It was replaced by a hint of amusement, but her tone was still severe. "Do you know what it is to be awakened out of a sound sleep after a long and tiring journey by two great girls coming bounce down on top of you? I don't know, but I can imagine, said Anne eagerly. I'm sure it must have been terrifying in the extreme. But then there is our side of it, too. She stopped suddenly. Have you any imagination, Miss Barry? Imagination at my age is a threat to life, the old lady said dryly. Well, if you did have imagination, continued Anne, you'd be able to put yourself in our place. We didn't know there was anyone in that bed, and you nearly scared us to death. And then we couldn't sleep in the spare room after being promised. I suppose you're used to sleeping in spare rooms. But just imagine what you would feel like if you were an orphan girl who never had such an honor. Mine was the sleep of the bitterly disappointed, Miss Barry. And to make matters worse, I was forced to lie awake all night with the knowledge that I had cost Diana her career as a world-famous concert pianist. All the snap had gone from the dragon by this time. Miss Barry actually laughed. I dare say your claim to sympathy is just as valid as mine, child. It all depends on the way we look at it. Then you'll forgive Diana? Miss Barry considered. Very well. I will reinstate Diana's music lessons in exchange for you. She patted Anne's hand. Coming up to Charlottetown to visit me on occasion. Me, Miss Barry? Yes, you, Anne of Green Gables. Diana can come along as well. You amuse me, child, and precious little amuses me at my age. Will you come? Anne nodded her head eagerly. Then go tell Diana she can be a concert pianist after all. Anne found Diana lurking in the hallway, where she had been listening to every word. You wouldn't think so to look at her, she whispered delightedly. But your Aunt Josephine is definitely a kindred spirit. Isn't it splendid, Diana? Kindred spirits aren't nearly so scarce as I used to believe.